Jessica grabbed a knife from the prep station and turned to face him. "Stay away from me," she warned, holding the blade in front of her with shaking hands. David laughed, a sound devoid of any human warmth. "You don't have it in you," he said. "You're too nice, too caring. That's why I chose you." He was right, and they both knew it. Jessica had never hurt anyone in her life. She couldn't imagine actually using the knife, even to save herself. But then she thought of Emma, sleeping peacefully at her grandmother's house, trusting that her mother would come home safely in the morning. She thought of all the plans they'd made, all the dreams they'd shared. She thought of the life her daughter deserved to have. When David lunged forward, Jessica didn't hesitate. She drove the knife into his chest with every ounce of strength she possessed. David looked down at the blade protruding from his body, surprise replacing the cold calculation in his eyes. He took a step backward, then another, before collapsing onto the kitchen floor. Jessica stood over him, the knife still in her hand. Watching as the life drained out of the man who had planned to kill her, she felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Just a profound exhaustion and the overwhelming need to call the police. The aftermath, the investigation that followed, revealed the true scope of David Kruger's crimes. Police found detailed files in his apartment documenting not just his surveillance of Jessica, but similar preparations for attacks on 3 other women in different counties. DNA evidence linked him to murders that had previously seemed unconnected. Jessica learned that she hadn't been his first intended victim at Mel's diner. 6 months earlier, he'd been planning to attack Linda, the woman who'd worked the night shift before Jessica. But Linda had quit suddenly to care for her sick mother, and David had been forced to find a new target. The randomness of it all was almost as terrifying as the attack itself. Jessica could have been anyone. She'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, working a job that made her vulnerable to a predator who had been hunting for the perfect victim. The media attention was intense but brief. Jessica refused most interview requests, wanting only to return to some semblance of normal life. She quit her job at Mel's diner and found work at a hospital, using the experience to accelerate her nursing studies. The nightmares took months to fade. Jessica installed security systems, changed her routines, and struggled with the hypervigilance that comes after surviving something that most people don't survive. But she was alive, and Emma still had her mother. The hardest part wasn't the fear or the trauma. It was the knowledge that evil could wear such an ordinary face, that monsters could sit in your restaurant and order coffee while planning your death. It was the realization that safety was largely an illusion, and that survival sometimes came down to split-second decisions and pure luck. But Jessica also learned something else, that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that when everything was on the line, she could fight for her life and win. The ripple effects of the case changed how law enforcement approached serial investigations in the region. David Kruger's methodical approach and interstate travel patterns had allowed him to avoid detection for years. His death prevented what investigators believed would have been many more murders. Mel's diner closed permanently 6 months after the attack. The owner, a kind man named Mel Kowalski, said he couldn't bear the thought of anyone else working alone in that isolated location. The building now houses a 24-hour convenience store with multiple employees and extensive security cameras. Jessica's story became a case study in survivor psychology and self-defense training. Her decision to fight back, despite her naturally gentle personality, demonstrated that anyone could find the strength to resist when their life depended on it. She completed her nursing degree 2 years ahead of schedule and now works in the emergency department of a major hospital. Her colleagues describe her as exceptionally calm under pressure, with an almost supernatural ability to sense when patients or visitors might pose a threat. Emma, now 10 years old, knows only that her mother once had to defend herself from a bad man. Jessica plans to tell her the full story when she's older, along with the lessons about trusting instincts and fighting back when necessary. "I don't want her to live in fear," Jessica says, "but I want her to understand that sometimes nice people have to do hard things to protect themselves and the people they love." The booth where David Kruger sat during his final hour was removed before the diner closed. Jessica had requested that it be destroyed rather than sold or donated. "Some things," she said, "carried too much darkness to be allowed to continue existing in the world." The lesson David Kruger's case illustrates how predators often hide in plain sight, using their ordinary appearance and polite demeanor to gain access to victims. He understood that people like Jessica, hardworking, trusting, focused on helping others, were particularly vulnerable to his manipulation. But Jessica's survival also demonstrates that victims are not powerless. Her decision to fight back, despite the odds against her, saved not only her own life, but potentially the lives of future victims. The story serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it orders coffee and says please and thank you while planning unspeakable acts. But it also reminds us that ordinary people can find extraordinary courage when everything they love is at stake. Jessica Martinez served her last customer on a Tuesday night in March. She had no idea he was planning to kill her. But when the moment came, she chose to fight for her life and her daughter's future. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to discover other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them. The last hour, David sat in his usual booth, but tonight felt different. Tonight, there was an electricity in the air that made Jessica's skin prickle with unease. She found herself checking the clock more frequently, counting the hours until her shift would end and she could go home to Emma. "More coffee?" she asked, approaching his table with the pot. It was the third refill she'd offered, though he'd barely touched the previous cups. "Thank you," he said, and this time he looked directly at her. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and there was something in them that made Jessica take an involuntary step backward. "Are you okay?" she asked, immediately regretting the question. She'd learned over the years that sometimes it was better not to engage with customers who seemed off. But the words had slipped out before she could stop them. "I'm fine," David replied, his voice still quiet and polite. "Just thinking about anything in particular?" Jessica found herself asking, though every instinct was telling her to walk away, to find something else to do on the other side of the diner. David smiled then, and it was the most terrifying thing Jessica had ever seen. It wasn't cruel or angry or even particularly threatening. It was simply empty, like looking into the face of something that only resembled a human being. "I'm thinking about endings," he said. "How things come to a close. How people say goodbye without knowing they're saying goodbye." Jessica felt a chill run down her spine. She forced herself to smile, to maintain the professional demeanor that had served her well through 3 years of dealing with difficult customers. "Well, I hope whatever you're thinking about works out," she said, backing away from the table. "Let me know if you need anything else." She retreated to the counter, her hands shaking slightly as she busied herself with unnecessary tasks. Something was very wrong with this man, but she couldn't quite articulate what it was. He hadn't said anything overtly threatening. He hadn't made any inappropriate comments or gestures. But every fiber of her being was screaming at her to get away from him. Jessica glanced at the clock. 12:43 a.m. Pete was long gone. The next customer probably wouldn't arrive for at least an hour, maybe 2. The phone was behind the counter, just a few steps away. She could call the police, but what would she tell them? That a customer was making her uncomfortable by drinking coffee and looking out the window? She tried to rationalize her fear. She was tired, stressed about money, worried about Emma's upcoming school expenses. Maybe she was just projecting her anxiety onto an innocent customer who couldn't sleep and needed somewhere warm to sit for a while. But when she looked back at David's booth, he was no longer staring out the window. He was watching her, and the expression on his face made her blood run cold. The moment of truth at 1:15 a.m., David stood up from his booth and walked to the counter. Jessica's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm, to act normal. "Ready for your check?" she asked, reaching for the receipt pad. "Actually," David said, "I was wondering if you could help me with something." Every alarm bell in Jessica's mind was ringing now, but she couldn't think of a way to refuse without seeming rude or paranoid. "What do you need?" Her voice barely steady. "My car won't start," David said. "Was hoping you might take a look. Sometimes it just needs a jump." Jessica's mouth went dry. Going outside with this man, alone, in the middle of the night, felt like the worst possible idea. But refusing might provoke him, and she was trapped in the diner with nowhere to run. "I don't really know much about cars," she said, hoping he would accept this excuse and leave. "It would just take a minute," David insisted. And now there was something different in his voice, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I'd really appreciate it." Jessica looked toward the kitchen, hoping against hope that Pete might have returned, that someone, anyone, might be there to help her. But the diner was empty, except for the two of them. "Let me call someone for you," she offered. "There's a 24-hour towing service." "No," David interrupted, and now the mask was slipping completely. "I need you to come outside with me now." Jessica's training kicked in. All the self-defense classes she'd taken after the divorce, all the warnings she'd heard about trusting strangers. She reached for the phone, but David was faster. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said. His voice calm again, almost gentle. "Just come outside with me, and this will all be over soon." Jessica knew then, with absolute certainty, that if she went outside with this man, she would never see Emma again. She would never finish nursing school, never build the life she'd been working so hard to create. She would become another statistic, another victim of a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. But knowing and being able to act on that knowledge were two different things. David was stronger than her, and he was between her and the door. The phone was in his reach now, and even if she could get to it, would help arrive in time. "Please," she whispered, hating the desperation in her own voice. "I have a little girl. She needs me." David's expression didn't change. "I know about Emma," he said, and Jessica's blood turned to ice. "She stays with her grandmother on the nights you work. She's probably asleep right now, dreaming about whatever 6-year-olds dream about." The fact that he knew her daughter's name, knew her routine, made Jessica realize that this wasn't random. This man had been watching her, planning this. She was going to die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But then she remembered something Pete had told her during her first week at the diner. "If you were ever in trouble, honey, you fight like hell. You make noise, you break things, you do whatever it takes to stay alive." Jessica looked David straight in the eye and made her choice. The fight, Jessica grabbed the coffee pot from the burner and swung it at David's head with all the strength she could muster. The glass shattered against his temple, sending scalding coffee across his face and chest. He screamed and released her wrist, stumbling backward. She ran for the door, but David recovered faster than she'd expected. He caught her just as she reached the entrance, tackling her to the floor. He struggled, Jessica clawing at his face while he tried to pin her down. "You're just making this worse for yourself," he panted, blood streaming from the cuts on his forehead. "I was going to make it quick." Jessica managed to knee him in the stomach and break free again. She scrambled toward the kitchen, looking for anything she could use as a weapon. David followed, no longer bothering to hide his intentions. "There's nowhere to go," he called after her. "I've been planning this for weeks. I know every exit, every hiding place. I can't escape." The last customer, the bell above the door, chimed softly as he walked in. Just another face in the endless stream of customers that passed through Mel's diner every day. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. It's a kind of quiet night when the fluorescent lights hummed a little too loudly and the coffee had been sitting on the burner a little too long. Jessica Martinez looked up from wiping down the counter, her tired eyes taking in the man who'd just entered. Average height, maybe mid-30s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Nothing remarkable about him at all. Chose a booth in the corner. The one by the window that looked out onto the empty parking lot, where a single street light cast long shadows across the asphalt. "Just coffee, please," he said when she approached with a menu. His voice was quiet, polite. He didn't make eye contact, just stared out the window at the darkness beyond. Jessica had been working the night shift at Mel's for 3 years, ever since her divorce left her struggling to make ends meet as a single mother. She'd seen every type of customer imaginable: truckers passing through, insomniacs seeking comfort in pie and conversation, college students cramming for exams. Something about this man felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on what. She poured his coffee, black, and he thanked her with a nod. He sat there for nearly an hour, occasionally sipping from his cup, mostly just staring out that window. Jessica found herself glancing over at him between her other duties, wondering what kept him awake at this hour, what thoughts were running through his mind. If she had known the truth, she would have run. She would have called the police. She would have done anything except what she did, which was simply go about her work, completely unaware that she was serving coffee to the man who would kill her in less than 6 hours. His name was David Kruger, and he had been planning this moment for weeks. The hunter's pattern, David Kruger had always been methodical. Even as a child, he approached everything with careful planning and attention to detail. His teachers praised his organizational skills. His employers valued his reliability. His neighbors considered him quiet but pleasant. The kind of man who kept his lawn perfectly trimmed and always returned borrowed tools in better condition than he'd received them. But beneath this facade of normalcy lived something much darker. David had been fantasizing about killing for as long as he could remember. Not in moments of anger or passion, but as a cold, calculated act that he planned and replayed in his mind with the same attention to detail he brought to everything else in his life. He worked as an insurance adjuster, a job that required him to travel frequently throughout the state. This mobility had served him well over the past 2 years, as he'd begun to act on his fantasies. The police in 3 different counties were investigating murders that they didn't yet realize were connected. Victims who seemed to have nothing in common, except that they'd all encountered a polite, unremarkable man shortly before their deaths. David's method was always the same. He would spend weeks observing potential victims, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities. He preferred women who worked alone, particularly during late-night shifts, when help would be far away. He studied their schedules, their habits, their relationships. By the time he made his move, he knew everything about them. Jessica Martinez had caught his attention 3 weeks earlier when he de-stopped at Mel's diner during a business trip. She worked the overnight shift alone except for the cook, an elderly man named Pete who usually left around midnight. The diner was isolated, sitting on a stretch of highway between 2 small towns, with the nearest police station 20 minutes away. Perfect. David had returned twice since then, always ordering just coffee, always sitting in the same booth, always watching. He learned that Jessica was 28, divorced, with a 6-year-old daughter named Emma who stayed with her grandmother on the nights Jessica worked. He learned that she was studying online to become a nurse, that she dreamed of giving her daughter a better life, that she was kind to difficult customers and generous with coffee refills. He learned everything about her except the most important thing, that she was about to become his 4th victim. The routine. Jessica's life had fallen into a predictable rhythm since the divorce. Days were for sleeping and spending time with Emma. Evenings were for studying or helping with homework. Nights were for work, serving coffee and comfort food to whoever wandered into Mel's between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was honest work, and it was slowly building towards something better. The nursing program would take another 2 years to complete. But then she'd have a career that could support her and Emma without relying on anyone else. Her ex-husband Miguel had been charming and unreliable in equal measure. He'd promised stability and delivered chaos, leaving Jessica to pick up the pieces when his get-rich-quick schemes inevitably failed. The divorce had been messy, but necessary. Jessica was determined to create a stable, secure life for her daughter, even if it meant working nights and living on very little sleep. The regulars at Mel's had become like family to her. There was Frank, the long-haul trucker who stopped in every Tuesday around 2 a.m. for pie and stories about his grandchildren. There was Sarah, the nurse from the county hospital, who came in after her shift for coffee and someone to talk to about the difficult cases that kept her awake. There was old Pete the cook, who treated Jessica like the daughter he never had and always made sure she ate something during her shift. These relationships made the long nights bearable. They reminded Jessica that even in the loneliest hours, there were connections to be made, kindnesses to be shared. She took pride in remembering how each customer liked their coffee and offering a listening ear to those who needed it. In creating a small oasis of warmth in the cold hours before dawn. But on this particular Tuesday night, the diner was quieter than usual. Frank's route had changed, so he wouldn't be coming through. Sarah was working a double shift at the hospital. Even Pete had left early, complaining of a headache that had been bothering him all day. Jessica was alone when David Kruger walked through the door for the last time. She had no way of knowing that he'd been waiting in the parking lot for over an hour, watching through the windows, making sure she was by herself. She had no way of knowing that he disabled the security cameras 2 days earlier, during a brief visit, when she'd been in the back room. She had no way of knowing that he destudied the diner's layout so thoroughly that he could navigate it in complete darkness. All she knew was that she had a customer who wanted coffee. Providing good service was something she took seriously. Even at midnight on a Tuesday when exhaustion was making her movements feel heavy and slow,